It was my third year as an assistant librarian when Cardinal Montini, later to become Pope Paul VI, summoned me to his private study. The war had ended, but its shadows still lingered over Rome like a persistent fever. The cardinal's face was grave as he handed me an ornate brass key, its surface worn smooth by countless hands. "Father Toretti," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you are to retrieve document 247B from Vault 7. Bring it directly to me, touch nothing else, and speak of this to no one." Vault 7 was legendary among us archivists, a restricted section that required special papal permission to access. I had never been inside, though I had heard whispers of what it contained. Documents deemed too dangerous for human eyes, artifacts that defied explanation, testimonies that challenged the very foundations of faith. The vault lay 3 levels below the main archive, accessible only through a narrow stone corridor lit by gas flames that seemed to burn with an unnatural blue tint. My footsteps echoed off the ancient walls as I descended, each step taking me deeper into the bowels of Vatican City. The air grew thick and oppressive, carrying with it the musty scent of centuries-old parchment and something else, something that reminded me uncomfortably of decay. The brass key turned easily in the heavy iron door, which swung open with a groan that seemed to reverberate through my very bones. Inside, the vault was larger than I had expected, its walls lined with countless shelves stretching up into darkness. Documents, scrolls, and bound volumes filled every available space, their spines bearing labels in languages I couldn't identify. Some appeared to be written in scripts that hurt to look at directly. Document 247B sat alone on a marble pedestal in the center of the room, bound in what appeared to be human skin, and secured with 7 iron clasps. The moment I laid eyes upon it, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. The binding seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and I could swear I heard the faintest whisper emanating from within its pages. As I approached, my shadow fell across the manuscript, and something extraordinary and terrifying occurred. The shadow began to move independently of my body, stretching and writhing across the ancient text like a living thing. I watched in horror as my own shadow reached out with fingers that were not quite fingers and began to caress the iron clasps. "No," I whispered, trying to step back, but found myself rooted to the spot. My shadow continued its dance across the manuscript, and with each movement, I felt something drain from my very soul. The whispers grew louder, resolving into words in a language that predated Latin, predated human speech itself. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the phenomenon stopped. My shadow snapped back to its proper place, and I found I could move again. But the damage was done. I had seen something that no living person should witness, and I knew with absolute certainty that my shadow would never again be entirely my own. I grabbed the manuscript with trembling hands and fled the vault, not stopping until I reached Cardinal Montini's study. When I placed the document on his desk, he took one look at my pale, sweat-drenched face and made the sign of the cross. "What did you see, my son?" he asked gently. "My shadow, Your Eminence," I whispered. It moved by itself. It touched the manuscript. The cardinal's face grew ashen. He opened his desk drawer and withdrew a small silver mirror, which he placed before me. "Look," he commanded. I peered into the mirror and gasped. My reflection looked back at me, but my shadow was facing the wrong direction, as if it were looking at something behind me that I could not see. "This is why we guard these documents so carefully," Cardinal Montini said solemnly. "Some knowledge comes with a price that cannot be undone. You will say nothing of this, and you will avoid mirrors when possible. In time, you may learn to live with what you have become." To this day, 30 years later, my shadow continues to act independently. Sometimes I catch it gesturing to unseen presences. Sometimes it writes words in languages I've never learned. I have learned to live with this curse, but I have never forgotten the whispers from that accursed manuscript, and I suspect I never will. Father Benedetto was an elderly priest from a small village in the Abruzzi Mountains, a man whose faith had sustained him through decades of service to his isolated flock. He had come to Rome seeking an audience with His Holiness, Pope John XXIII, bearing with him a confession so disturbing that his local bishop had refused to hear it and had instead sent him directly to the Vatican. I was present in my capacity as archivist when Father Benedetto was brought before a special tribunal consisting of 3 cardinals and the prefect of the Sacred Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. The old priest's hands shook as he began to speak, his voice barely audible in the vast chamber. "Your Eminences," he began, "I come to you not as one seeking absolution, but as one who must unburden himself of knowledge that threatens not only my soul, but the souls of all who hear it. For I have heard a confession that should not exist, from a penitent who cannot be." He paused, crossing himself with trembling fingers before continuing. 3 months ago, I was awakened in the middle of the night by someone knocking at the church door. When I opened it, I found a young woman, perhaps 20 years of age, dressed in the style of clothing from centuries past. Her face was pale as moonlight, her eyes dark as the deepest well. She begged me to hear her confession, claiming that she had been waiting 200 years for a priest who would listen. I brought her into the confessional, though every instinct told me to flee. When she began to speak, her voice carried the accent of medieval Italian, words and phrases that had not been used for centuries. She told me of terrible sins, not the usual transgressions of lust or greed, but sins against the very nature of creation itself. She spoke of pacts made with entities that existed before God brought light to the world, of rituals performed in the catacombs beneath ancient Rome, of children sacrificed to appease hungers that could never be satisfied. She confessed to having lived for 8 centuries, sustained by acts so vile that I cannot repeat them even here, in this sacred place. But the most terrible part was yet to come. She told me that she was not alone, that there were others like her, hidden throughout the world, masquerading as holy men and women, infiltrating the very foundations of our faith. She claimed that some had risen to positions of great power within the church itself, working to corrupt it from within. When she finished her confession, I attempted to grant her absolution, but the words would not come. My voice failed me, as if God himself prevented me from speaking the sacred formula. The woman looked at me with eyes full of ancient sorrow and said, "I knew it would be so. We are beyond forgiveness, Father. We are beyond God's love. But I thank you for listening." She rose to leave, but as she reached the door of the confessional, she turned back to me one final time. "Beware, Father," she said. "They know that I have spoken. They will come for you, as they came for the others who have heard too much. Hide yourself well, for they do not forgive those who possess their secrets." With that, she was gone, and I have not seen her since. But I have felt them watching me, your Eminences. I have seen shadows where none should be, heard whispers in empty rooms. 3 other priests in my diocese have died under mysterious circumstances in the past month, good men whose only crime was to ask too many questions about the stranger visitors who have been seen in our villages after dark. Father Benedetto's testimony concluded, but his hands continued to shake uncontrollably. One of the cardinals leaned forward and asked, "Father, do you believe this woman's claims to be true?" The old priest was quiet for a long moment before responding. "Your Eminence, I have served God faithfully for 47 years. I have heard thousands of confessions from sinners of every kind. I know the difference between madness and truth, between fantasy and genuine evil. What I heard in that confessional was the voice of something that should not exist, confessing to acts that defy both human understanding and divine mercy. Whether she spoke truth or lies, the very fact that such words could be spoken in a house of God fills me with a terror that I cannot shake." The tribunal deliberated for 3 hours before reaching their decision. Father Benedetto would be relocated to a secure monastery in the Swiss Alps, where he would spend his remaining days in prayer and contemplation, never again to serve in a pastoral capacity. All records of his testimony would be sealed in the deepest vaults of the secret archives. I was tasked with personally escorting Father Benedetto to his new home. During our journey, he remained largely silent, but as we approached the monastery, he turned to me with tears in his eyes. "Father Torretti," he said, "promise me that if you ever encounter anything like what I have described, you will not try to investigate further. Some knowledge is too dangerous for mortal minds to bear. I fear that my curiosity has doomed not only myself, but others as well." I promised him I would heed his warning, though I could not have known then how prophetic his words would prove to be. Father Benedetto died 6 months later, under circumstances that were officially attributed to heart failure. But the monk who found his body reported that his face was frozen in an expression of absolute terror, and that his cell was filled with the scent of sulfur and decay. Most disturbing of all, the wooden crucifix above his bed was found turned upside down, though it had been securely fastened to the wall and showed no signs of having been tampered with. I have often wondered about the truth of his mysterious penitence claims. In my years since that day, I have encountered documents and artifacts that suggest she may not have been entirely mad, but that is a story for another time. The death of Pope John Paul I, after only 33 days in office, sent shockwaves throughout the Church and the world. Officially, he died of a heart attack, alone in his papal apartments. But I know the truth of what really happened that September night, and I know why certain photographs taken in the days before his death were confiscated and sealed away forever. Luca Torriani was one of the Vatican's official photographers, a devout man whose family had served the Church for generations. He possessed an extraordinary eye for capturing not just images, but the essence of spiritual moments. His photographs of papal masses and ceremonies were renowned throughout Europe for their ability to convey the divine presence in human gatherings. But Luca possessed another gift, one that he initially considered a blessing, but which ultimately proved to be a curse more terrible than he could have imagined. His cameras, for reasons that no one could explain, sometimes captured things that were invisible to the naked eye. At first, these anomalies seemed benign, orbs of light around blessed objects, ethereal figures near altars during particularly sacred ceremonies, halos of radiance surrounding holy relics. The Church hierarchy viewed these images as evidence of divine intervention, and Luca was praised for his special gift. His photographs were used in religious publications and were even displayed in the Vatican museums as examples of miraculous phenomena. But as time passed, his cameras began to reveal increasingly disturbing images. In the weeks leading up to Pope John Paul I's election, Luca had been tasked with documenting the papal conclave and the activities surrounding the transition of power. He worked tirelessly, capturing hundreds of images of cardinals, ceremonies, and private moments within the Vatican walls. It was only when he developed the film that he began to notice something was terribly wrong. In photograph after photograph, shadowy figures appeared in places where no one had been standing. These were not the benevolent spiritual presences he had captured. Before, these entities were dark, malevolent, and seemed to be watching the proceedings with intense, predatory interest. More disturbing still, these shadows appeared to be growing larger and more numerous with each passing day. The most unsettling images showed these dark figures clustered around certain high-ranking church officials, hovering over them like parasites feeding off their spiritual energy. Luca brought his concerns to me, as I was responsible for cataloging and storing all official Vatican photographs in the archives. "Father Torretti," he said, spreading the developed photographs across my desk, "look at these images and tell me I'm not losing my mind." I examined the photographs carefully, and my blood ran cold. The shadowy entities were clearly visible in dozens of images, and they seemed to be focused particularly intently on the newly elected pope. In one photograph taken during John Paul I's first papal audience, no fewer than 7 dark figures surrounded the pontiff's chair, their forms seeming to reach toward him with grasping, claw-like appendages. "Have you shown these to anyone else?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "No," Luca replied. "I wanted your opinion first. Do you think there's some kind of photographic defect? Or perhaps..." His words were interrupted by a knock at my office door. Without waiting for permission to enter, Cardinal Casaroli, the Secretary of State, stepped into the room accompanied by 2 Swiss guards. "Father Torretti," the cardinal said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument, "you will please surrender all photographs taken by Signor Torriani during the past month. They are to be classified under papal seal immediately." "Your Eminence," I began, but he held up a hand to silence me. "This is not a request," he said firmly. "These photographs contain sensitive material that could be misinterpreted and cause scandal. They are to be locked away and never spoken of again." As the guards collected the photographs, Cardinal Casaroli turned to Luca. "Signor Torriani, you will report to the Apostolic Camera tomorrow morning. You are being reassigned to administrative duties effective immediately. Your services as a photographer are no longer required." After they left, Luca and I sat in stunned silence. Finally, he spoke. "They know what those shadows are, don't they? They've seen them before." I nodded grimly. "I fear they have. And I suspect that Pope John Paul I saw them too." The next morning, we awoke to the shocking news that the Pope had died during the night. The official cause was given as a heart attack, but no autopsy was performed, and the body was embalmed with unusual haste. Most telling of all, the papal apartments were sealed immediately, and no one was permitted to photograph the scene. But Luca had managed to keep one photograph hidden from Cardinal Casaroli's search, an image he had taken just hours before the Pope's death, showing the pontiff alone in his private study. In this final photograph, the shadowy entities had multiplied tenfold, completely surrounding the papal chair in a writhing mass of darkness that seemed to be pressing in on the Holy Father from all sides. Most horrifying of all, the Pope himself appeared to be looking directly at these entities, his face showing not fear, but a terrible understanding. It was as if he could see them too, and knew exactly what they were. Luca brought this final photograph to me the day after the Pope's funeral. "I can't keep this," he said, his hands shaking as he placed the image on my desk. "But I can't destroy it either. Someone needs to know the truth." I locked the photograph in my private safe, where it remains to this day. 3 weeks later, Luca was found dead in his apartment, apparently from a heart attack identical to the one that had claimed the Pope's life. He was only 34 years old and had no history of heart problems. The official investigation concluded that both deaths were natural, coincidental occurrences. But I have studied that final photograph countless times over the years, and I have reached a different conclusion. I believe that Pope John Paul I discovered something about those shadow entities, perhaps their true nature, perhaps their purpose within the church hierarchy, and I believe he was silenced before he could reveal what he had learned. The photograph remains in my possession, a silent testament to the forces of darkness that lurk within even the most sacred places. Sometimes, late at night, I take it from the safe and study it by candlelight, searching for clues about what the shadows truly represent. But each time I do so, I notice that they seem to have shifted position slightly, as if they are aware of my scrutiny, and are slowly, patiently, turning their attention toward me. I fear that my time is running short, which is why I am finally sharing these stories with you. Someone must know the truth of what lurks in the corridors of power, even if that truth is too terrible for most to believe. Our final tale concerns perhaps the most frightening document in all of the Vatican's secret archives, a prophecy so accurate and so terrifying in its implications that only 3 people in the entire church hierarchy are permitted to read it in its entirety. I am one of those 3, and the knowledge I have gained has haunted me every day since. The prophecy of Saint Malachi, as it is known, was written in 1139 by Archbishop Malachi of Armagh during a visit to Rome. In a divine vision, he foresaw the identity and characteristics of every pope who would reign from his time until the end of the papacy itself. The prophecy consists of 112 brief Latin phrases, each describing a future pope in cryptic but remarkably accurate terms. What makes this document so extraordinary is not merely its prophetic accuracy, though that alone is staggering, but rather what it reveals about the ultimate fate of the Catholic Church and, indeed, of the world itself. For the prophecy does not simply end with the 112th Pope. It continues with additional verses that were deemed so disturbing that they were separated from the main document and hidden in a lead-lined box in the deepest vault of the archives. I first encountered the complete prophecy in 1985, when Pope John Paul II personally tasked me with verifying its authenticity as part of a secret investigation into eschatological documents. What I found in those hidden verses changed my understanding of everything I had believed about faith, prophecy, and the nature of divine revelation. The 110th Pope in Malachi's prophecy is described with the phrase Gloria Olivae, the glory of the olive. Based on my calculations, we are now very close to seeing this Pope ascend to the throne of St. Peter. But it is the 112th and final Pope who fills me with dread, for he is described as Petrus Romanus, Peter the Roman. According to the prophecy, This final pope will preside over the Church during the most terrible persecution in its history. The very foundations of faith will crumble, and ancient evils that have long been held in check by the Church's spiritual authority will be unleashed upon the world. But even this is not the most terrifying part of Malachi's vision. The hidden verses reveal what will happen after Petrus Romanus dies. They describe a time when the papacy will become vacant, when the see of Peter will remain empty, not by choice, but because no one will be worthy or able to fill it. During this interregnum, something that has been imprisoned beneath the Vatican for nearly 2 millennia will finally break free. The prophecy refers to this entity only as the first shadow, the original darkness that existed before creation, the void that God pushed back when he spoke the first words of light. According to Malachi's vision, this primordial evil has been slowly growing stronger throughout the centuries, feeding on human suffering and corruption, waiting for the moment when the Church's spiritual defenses would finally weaken enough to allow its escape. Most disturbing of all, the prophecy suggests that this has always been the true purpose behind the Vatican itself. The Church was not merely built to spread the gospel, it was constructed as a spiritual prison, its every stone blessed and consecrated to contain an evil so profound that its release would herald the end of all creation. But the prison is failing. The hidden verses describe signs that have already begun to manifest. The increase in supernatural phenomena within Vatican walls, the growing number of unexplained deaths among clergy, the appearance of shadow entities in sacred spaces, and most ominously, the gradual corruption of certain high-ranking church officials who have begun to serve not God, but the imprisoned darkness itself. I have seen evidence of all these signs during my years in the archive. The shadow that follows me, the confession heard by Father Benedetto, the dark entities captured in Luca's photographs, all of these are symptoms of the same underlying disease. The spiritual barriers that have contained the first shadow for 2,000 years are beginning to crack. The prophecy indicates that we have perhaps 2 or 3 more pontificates before the final crisis arrives. When Petrus Romanus dies, the College of Cardinals will convene in conclave, but no pope will be chosen. The conclave will continue for days, then weeks, then months, as cardinal after cardinal is found unworthy or meets with mysterious death. During this time, the spiritual protection that emanates from the papal office will gradually fade, and the first shadow will begin to exert its influence more directly. Eventually, the conclave will be abandoned, and the Vatican will be evacuated as supernatural phenomena become impossible to hide or contain. The last faithful will flee Rome, carrying with them whatever sacred relics and documents they can save. And in the empty chambers beneath St. Peter's Basilica, something that has waited since before the foundation of the world will finally break free from its ancient bonds. What happens next? The prophecy does not clearly state. It speaks of darkness covering the earth, of the dead rising from their graves, of the very fabric of reality beginning to unravel. It suggests that the first shadow will attempt to undo creation itself, to return the universe to the primordial void from which it emerged. But there is hope, even in this darkest of visions. The prophecy's final verses speak of a remnant of the faithful who will preserve the light during the coming darkness. It foretells that after a period of tribulation lasting 7 years, a new pope will arise, not elected by any conclave, but chosen directly by divine intervention. This pope will possess powers unknown since the time of the apostles, and under his leadership, the faithful will drive back the first shadow and rebuild the church from its ashes. Whether this represents literal truth or symbolic prophecy, I cannot say. But I have spent 30 years studying every word of Malachi's vision, and I am convinced of its essential accuracy. The signs are all around us, growing stronger each year. The shadows lengthen, the barriers weaken, and the ancient darkness stirs in its prison beneath our feet. This is why I am telling you these stories, my friend. Not to frighten you, but to prepare you. For if Malachi's prophecy is true, then the next 2 decades will witness events that will test the faith of even the most devout. Those who survive what is coming will need to be strong, and they will need to remember that even in the deepest darkness, the light of God cannot be completely extinguished. I am old now and tired, and the shadows that follow me grow longer each day. I do not think I will live to see the final crisis, and perhaps that is a mercy. But you are young, and you may witness the end of one age and the beginning of another. If that time comes, remember what I have told you. Remember that there have always been those who stood against the darkness, and there will always be those who carry the light. Keep these stories safe, and when the time is right, share them with those who need to know. For in the end, truth is our greatest weapon against the lies that darkness whispers, and knowledge, no matter how terrible, is better than ignorance when facing the ultimate evil. The candles grow low, and I find I can speak no more tonight. But before you leave, let me show you one final thing, a photograph I have carried with me for 7 years now. It shows the current Holy Father during a private moment of prayer in his apartments. Look closely at the shadows around his chair. Count them, and then pray, my friend. Pray that Saint Malachi was wrong, and that the darkness I see gathering will somehow be held back for another generation. But I fear our time grows short, and the shadow that has followed me all these years whispers that the end is closer than we dare to believe. I have spent 43 years in these hallowed halls, tending to manuscripts that predate Christ himself, preserving knowledge that could reshape human understanding of the divine. But there are some books, some knowledge, that should never see the light of day. Tonight, I feel compelled to share 3 such encounters, though I pray God will forgive me for breaking my vows of silence. The first concerns the Codex Susurrorum, the Codex of Whispers. It arrived at the Vatican in 1623, part of a collection seized during the trial of Urbain Grandier, the priest accused of demonic possession in Loudun. Cardinal Richelieu himself ordered its transfer to our archives, with specific instructions that it should never be catalogued or made available to researchers. The codex appeared unremarkable at first glance, bound in what I assumed was dark leather, though the material had an unsettling texture, almost like skin that had been stretched and dried. The pages were vellum, yellowed with age, covered in Latin text written in a precise, almost mechanical hand. What made it unusual was the complete absence of any illuminations or decorative elements that were standard in medieval manuscripts. I was tasked with its preliminary examination in the winter of 1987. My predecessor, Father Benedetti, had fallen ill after just 3 days of working with the text. The doctors claimed it was exhaustion, but I had seen his hands, they trembled constantly, and his eyes held a haunted quality that spoke of something far worse than fatigue. The codex's content was disturbing from the very first page. It purported to be a guide for opening doorways between the realm of the living and the spaces that exist in the silence between God's words. The author, who identified himself only as Servus Silenti, servant of silence, claimed to have discovered a method of communication with entities that existed in the gaps between divine creation. According to the text, God's word had brought forth all of creation, but in the pauses between his utterances, in the moments of divine silence, other things had found purchase in reality. These entities, the whisperers, had been observing humanity since the beginning, feeding on the spaces between thoughts, the gaps in memory, the silence between heartbeats. The ritual described in the codex was deceptively simple. One needed only to sit in complete darkness, focus on the space between one's own thoughts, and recite a specific sequence of Latin phrases. The words themselves seemed wrong, not grammatically incorrect, but wrong in some fundamental way, as if they had been designed for a mouth that was not quite human. I should have stopped reading then. I should have followed protocol and sealed the codex away. But the academic in me was fascinated. The text referenced historical events with startling accuracy, mentioning plagues and disasters years before they occurred. If authentic, this was potentially one of the most significant prophetic texts in the Church's possession. On the 3rd night of my examination, I found myself alone in the archives reading room. The building was empty, save for the security guards, and the silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in the vaulted ceiling. I had reached a section of the codex that contained what appeared to be testimonials from people who had successfully performed the ritual. A merchant from Prague described meeting his deceased wife in the space between sleeping and waking. A nun from Avignon claimed to have learned the true names of angels from voices that spoke in the darkness of her cell. Most disturbing was the account of a Venetian scholar who wrote of gaining knowledge of future events by listening to the whispers that filled the silence between church bells. As I read these accounts, I became aware of the quality of silence in the archive. It was not the peaceful quiet of a library, but something heavier, more expectant. It felt as though the darkness itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I continued reading by the light of a single desk lamp, its yellow glow creating a small island of illumination in the vast darkness. The codex described the progression of contact with the whisperers. First came an awareness of their presence, a sense of being watched from the corners of one's vision. Then came the whispers themselves, barely audible sounds that seemed to emerge from the silence rather than break it. The final stage was direct communication. According to the text, those who reached this level could ask the whisperers questions about past, present, and future. They could learn secrets hidden in the hearts of kings, discover the location of lost treasures, or gain insight into the mysteries of creation itself. But there was a price for this knowledge. The whisperers fed on human attention. Each moment spent listening to them gave them more substance in our reality. The text warned that prolonged contact could result in the listener becoming unable to perceive normal human speech, hearing only the whispers that filled every silence. Eventually, they would become conduits for the whisperers, their own voices joining the chorus that spoke in the spaces between words. I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't notice when the normal sounds of the building, the hum of ventilation, the distant traffic from the street began to fade. The silence deepened around me until it felt like a physical presence. That's when I heard the first whisper. It was so soft I almost convinced myself it was imaginary, just the sound of air moving through the ancient building. But as I sat frozen at my desk, barely breathing, I heard it again. Not words exactly, but something that suggested meaning, like overhearing a conversation in a language you almost understood. The whisper seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, emerging from the darkness beyond my small circle of light. As I strained to listen, more voices joined the first. They spoke in overlapping murmurs, creating a susurrus that filled the space between my heartbeats. I wanted to close the codex, to turn on every light in the archive and flee to my quarters, but I found myself paralyzed, not by fear but by a terrible curiosity. The whispers were becoming clearer, resolving into fragments of Latin, Greek, and languages I couldn't identify. They spoke of events yet to come, of secrets buried in the deepest vaults of the Vatican, of knowledge that could change the course of human history. One voice, clearer than the others, began to speak directly to me. It told me my name, not just Giuseppe, but the name my mother had whispered to me in the cradle, a name I had never told another living soul. It spoke of my doubts about my faith, my secret questions about the nature of God, my fear that I had wasted my life in service to something that might not exist. The voice offered me certainty. It promised to show me proof of the divine, to answer every question that had ever troubled my mind. All I had to do was continue listening, to open myself fully to their whispers. I don't know how long I sat there, suspended between terror and temptation. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they seemed to originate from inside my own skull. I could feel my grip on ordinary reality beginning to loosen. The reading room around me began to fade, and I sensed vast spaces opening beyond the walls, dimensions that existed in the gaps between God's creation. It was the sound of footsteps in the corridor that broke the spell. Father Martinez, making his regular security rounds, was approaching the archive. The whispers fell silent instantly, and the normal sounds of the building rushed back like water filling a vacuum. I slammed the codex shut, my hands shaking so violently I could barely manage the simple motion. When Father Martinez entered the reading room, he found me pale and sweating, my clothes soaked through despite the winter chill. He insisted on escorting me to my quarters, concerned that I might be suffering from the same malady that had afflicted Father Benedetti. I spent the next 3 days in bed, claiming illness. But in truth, I was terrified to return to the archive. Every moment of silence became an invitation for the whispers to return. I found myself avoiding quiet spaces, keeping the radio on constantly in my quarters, even humming to myself to fill any gaps in ambient sound. When I finally returned to work, I immediately recommended that the Codex Usurorum be transferred to the restricted vault, accessible only with written permission from the Cardinal Secretary of State. I wrote a brief report describing it as a medieval text of uncertain provenance containing potentially heretical material unsuitable for general research, but I kept copies of certain pages hidden in my personal files. The prophetic passages proved remarkably accurate over the following years. The Codex had predicted the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, even the date of Pope John Paul II's death. I began to wonder if my encounter had been real, or if I had simply been exposed to genuine prophetic knowledge. That question tormented me for years, until I encountered the second manuscript that would forever change my understanding of what lurked in the darker corners of our archives. The second manuscript came to my attention purely by accident, during the Great Reorganization of 1998. We were digitizing portions of the medieval collection when I discovered a misplaced document in the binding of a 14th century psalter. It was a brief testament written in the shaking hand of Cardinal Alessandro Torriani, dated 1478, just days before his death. Cardinal Torriani had been a trusted advisor to Pope Sixtus IV, a man known for his scholarship and devotion. His sudden death at the age of 42 had been attributed to a fever, but this hidden testament told a very different story. According to his account, Torriani had been tasked with investigating reports of miraculous healings associated with a relic recently acquired by the Church, a fragment of bone purported to be from Saint Lucy, the patron saint of the blind. The relic had been purchased from a Venetian merchant who claimed it had been in his family for generations, passed down from ancestors who had lived in Syracuse during the saint's lifetime. The healings were remarkable and well documented. The blind received sight, the lame walked, and tumors vanished overnight. Pilgrims traveled from across Europe to touch the reliquary that housed the bone fragment. Pope Sixtus, initially skeptical, had been convinced by the sheer volume of verified miracles, and planned to officially canonize the relic during the upcoming Easter celebrations. But Torriani had begun to notice disturbing patterns in the healings. While the miracles themselves were genuine, they came with unexpected side effects that manifested weeks or months later. Those who had regained their sight began to see things that weren't there: shadowy figures lurking in the corners of their vision, faces and reflections that didn't match their own, landscapes that flickered between the familiar and the utterly alien. The lame who had learned to walk again found themselves compelled to travel to specific locations, often remote and dangerous places, where they would disappear for days or weeks before returning with no memory of their absence. Most disturbing were the cases of miraculous tumor removals. The patients were indeed cured, but within months they began to change in subtle ways, their personalities shifting, their voices taking on different tones, their mannerisms becoming foreign to their families. Torriani had initially attributed these reports to hysteria or coincidence. Miraculous healings often produced psychological side effects as people adjusted to their new circumstances. But as he investigated further, he discovered that all of the affected individuals had begun to share certain behaviors. They were drawn to specific locations within Rome, ancient sites predating the Christian era. They spoke in their sleep, often in languages they had never learned, and they all reported the same recurring dream: a vast underground chamber filled with rows of sleeping figures, waiting to wake. The cardinal's investigation led him to research the relic's provenance more thoroughly. The Venetian merchant's family records were surprisingly detailed, tracing the bone fragment's ownership back through centuries. What Torriani discovered chilled him to the bone. The relic had indeed originated in Syracuse, but not from the tomb of Saint Lucy. According to documents that predated Christianity by several centuries, the bone fragment came from the body of a woman named Lucia, who had been a priestess of an ancient cult dedicated to a deity the Romans had called somnium profundum, the deep sleep. This cult had practiced a form of healing that involved the temporary possession of the patient by benevolent spirits. The priestess Lucia had been renowned for her ability to channel these entities, allowing them to repair damaged flesh and bone. But the Roman authorities had discovered that the spirits were not benevolent at all. They were something far older and more dangerous, entities that existed in a state between life and death, sustained by inhabiting human bodies. The cult had been violently suppressed in 312 AD, its temples destroyed and its priestesses executed. But the Romans had made a crucial error. They had buried Lucia's remains in consecrated ground, believing that Christian sanctification would prevent any further supernatural activity. Instead, the confusion between the pagan Lucia and the Christian Saint Lucy had created a perfect camouflage for the ancient power that resided in her bones. Torriani realized that the miraculous healings were actually instances of partial possession. The entities channeled through the relic were repairing damaged bodies while simultaneously establishing footholds in the physical world. Each healing created a new host, someone who could be called upon when the entities decided to fully manifest. The Cardinal's testament described his growing horror as he uncovered evidence of similar relics scattered throughout the Church's collection. Bones, cloth fragments, and religious artifacts that had been venerated for centuries were actually conduits for pre-Christian entities that had learned to masquerade as Christian saints. The Church, in its zeal to collect holy relics, had inadvertently become a repository for some of the most dangerous supernatural artifacts in human history. But the most terrifying discovery was yet to come. Torriani had gained access to records dating back to the earliest days of the Church, documents that revealed a pattern of calculated deception spanning centuries. The entities were not random parasites seeking human hosts. They were part of a coordinated invasion, patiently infiltrating the Church and using its global reach to position themselves throughout the Christian world. The Cardinal had traced their activities to a specific location beneath Rome, a complex of pre-Christian catacombs that had been sealed and forgotten when the city converted to Christianity. According to his research, this was where the entities had established their primary stronghold, a vast chamber where hundreds of possessed individuals gathered to receive instructions from whatever intelligence coordinated their activities. Torriani's testament broke off abruptly at this point, but he had included crude maps showing the location of the sealed entrances to these forgotten catacombs. His final entry, written in a barely legible scrawl, contained a desperate warning. "They know I have discovered them. The fever that burns in my blood is not natural. They are calling me to join their number. May God forgive me. I can feel my will crumbling. If anyone finds this testament, know that the Church harbors enemies more ancient and patient than any heresy. They sleep beneath our feet, and they are beginning to wake." I spent weeks researching Cardinal Torriani's claims, cross-referencing his maps with modern surveys of Rome's underground structures. To my amazement, his locations corresponded exactly with areas that had been sealed by Church authorities in the 16th century, officially for structural safety concerns. The records surrounding these closures were suspiciously sparse, signed off by cardinals who had died under mysterious circumstances within months of authorizing the work. Even more disturbing was what I found when I examined the Church's relic collection using Torriani's criteria. Dozens of artifacts showed signs of pre-Christian origin, their supposed Christian provenance supported only by documentation that appeared to have been deliberately falsified. The pattern was unmistakable. Once you knew what to look for, ancient pagan artifacts had been systematically rebranded as Christian relics and integrated into the Church's most sacred collections. I began to understand why certain areas of the Vatican were off-limits, even to senior clergy, why some reliquaries were never opened for public veneration, and why specific storage areas were blessed and reconsecrated on a monthly basis. The Church had discovered Torriani's findings, or reached similar conclusions independently, and had spent centuries carefully containing threats that could not be destroyed without risking massive spiritual contamination. But containment, I was beginning to realize, was not the same as elimination. The entities Torriani had discovered were still present, still patient, still waiting for the right moment to complete whatever plan they had been developing for 2,000 years. That realization led me to the third and most terrifying discovery, one that revealed the true scope of what we faced, and why my own role as Vatican Librarian had been far more important than I had ever imagined. The third manuscript found me, rather than the other way around. In 2003, during routine maintenance of the climate control systems, workers discovered a hidden chamber behind a false wall in the deepest level of the secret archives. The room contained a single item, an ancient palimpsest bound in chains of an unusual metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The palimpsest itself was extraordinary layers of text written and erased over centuries, creating a temporal archaeology of human knowledge. The topmost layer contained what appeared to be astronomical calculations in Arabic, while deeper layers revealed Latin prayers, Greek philosophical treatises, and symbols that predated any known writing system. But it was the covering letter, sealed with wax, bearing the personal ring of Saint Malachy of Armagh, that truly caught my attention. Malachy, the 12th century Irish saint, famous for his prophecies of the popes, had left specific instructions that this palimpsest should only be examined when the church faces its final trial, and the servants of the deep sleep prepare to complete their ancient work. As the Vatican's senior archivist, the decision of whether to examine the palimpsest fell to me. I had already encountered the Codex Susurrorum and Cardinal Torriani's testament. I was beginning to see the connections between these discoveries, the common thread of ancient entities infiltrating the church and patiently working towards some ultimate goal. The timing also seemed significant. We were living through an era of unprecedented crisis for the Catholic Church. Scandals rocked congregations worldwide. Attendance was declining in traditional strongholds, and many questioned whether the institution could survive in its current form. If Malachy's conditions had ever been met, they were being met now. I decided to examine the palimpsest, but I took precautions based on my previous experiences. I arranged for the work to be done in a specially prepared room with multiple light sources, audio recording equipment, and regular check-ins from colleagues. I would not allow myself to be caught alone in silence again. The examination process took months. Using advanced imaging techniques, I slowly revealed layer after layer of hidden text. The palimpsest was like an archaeological dig conducted on parchment, each stratum revealing different eras of human history and knowledge. The deepest layers were the most disturbing. They contained symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly, requiring me to examine them only through reflected light or peripheral vision. These symbols appeared to be a form of proto-writing that predated human civilization, possibly by millennia. Gradually, I began to understand that the palimpsest was more than just a collection of texts. It was a key. Each layer contained part of a vast encryption system that, when properly assembled, would reveal the true history of the entities that had been infiltrating human civilization since its earliest days. What I discovered challenged everything I thought I knew about the history of Christianity and the nature of reality itself. The entities I had encountered in my previous investigations were not supernatural beings or demons in the traditional sense. They were the remnants of a previous intelligent species that had once ruled the earth. According to the palimpsest, these beings had existed long before humans evolved. They had built vast civilizations, mastered technologies that seemed like magic, and developed forms of consciousness that could exist independently of physical bodies. But something had gone wrong. Their civilization had collapsed in a catastrophe that had left their world uninhabitable and most of their species dead or dormant. The survivors had found a way to preserve themselves by entering a state of suspended animation, the deep sleep referenced in various documents I had encountered. They retreated to underground chambers and waited for conditions to improve. But the catastrophe had been so complete that they remained dormant for millions of years, until the rise of human civilization provided them with new opportunities. Humans, with our complex brains and rich emotional lives, proved to be ideal hosts for their consciousness. But full possession was difficult and often resulted in the host's death. Instead, they developed more subtle forms of infiltration, partial possession, influence through dreams and visions, and the manipulation of human institutions. The rise of organized religion had been their greatest opportunity. By positioning themselves as gods, spirits, and saints, they could influence human behavior on a massive scale. The establishment of the Catholic Church, with its global reach and centralized authority, had provided them with the perfect vehicle for worldwide coordination. For nearly 2,000 years, they had patiently inserted themselves into positions of power within the church hierarchy. Not all clergy were compromised. The majority remained genuinely human, but enough key positions were occupied by hosts or influenced individuals to steer the institution's development according to their needs. The palimpsest revealed that major historical events, from the Crusades to the Inquisition to the Counter-Reformation, had been orchestrated to serve their long-term goals. Wars had been fought to capture specific territories containing entrances to their underground strongholds. Heretics had been eliminated not for theological reasons, but because they had stumbled upon evidence of the infiltration. The Church's vast wealth had been systematically channeled into projects that supported their agenda. But most disturbing was what the palimpsest revealed about their ultimate goal. The entities were not content to remain hidden parasites feeding on human civilization. They were preparing for a full emergence, a moment when they would reveal themselves and reclaim the earth as their own. This emergence required specific conditions to be met: astronomical alignments, population levels, technological development, and spiritual states all had to reach precise parameters. According to the calculations hidden in the deepest layers of the palimpsest, these conditions were rapidly approaching. The signs were already visible to those who knew what to look for. The increasing frequency of unexplained phenomena, the rise of conspiracy theories that came suspiciously close to the truth, the growing sense of unease and disconnection that plagued modern society, all were indicators that the deep sleep was beginning to end. But the most chilling revelation was personal. The palimpsest contained detailed profiles of key individuals throughout history who had been selected for specific roles in the entity's plan. Scholars, clergy, and researchers who had been manipulated into uncovering just enough truth to serve the entity's needs, while remaining ignorant of the larger picture. I found my own name in these records. According to the text, my entire career had been orchestrated. My appointment to the Vatican archives, my access to sensitive documents, even my encounters with the Codex Susurrorum and Torriani's Testament, all had been arranged to bring me to this moment, to this discovery. I was not a heroic researcher uncovering ancient secrets. I was an unwitting pawn, selected for my particular combination of scholarly rigor, spiritual doubt, and psychological vulnerability. My discoveries had not been accidents or acts of divine providence. They had been carefully staged revelations designed to prepare me for my ultimate role. The palimpsest explained that I was to be the herald of their emergence. My scholarly credentials and position within the Vatican would lend credibility to the revelations I would soon share with the world. The documents I had discovered would serve as proof that the entities were not invaders, but the rightful inheritors of the earth, temporarily displaced by a cosmic accident. When the time came, I would write papers, give lectures, and provide testimony that would help humanity understand and accept their new role as junior partners in a cosmic hierarchy. The chaos and confusion of the transition would be minimized by having respected religious authorities explain that this had always been God's plan, that the entities were actually angels or advanced spiritual beings sent to guide humanity into a new age. Reading these predictions of my own future actions filled me with a horror deeper than anything I had experienced with the previous manuscripts. The entities had not simply studied human psychology, they had mastered it so completely that they could predict and control individual behavior across decades. But knowledge of manipulation is sometimes enough to break its power. Understanding their plan gave me a choice I had not known I possessed. I could fulfill my assigned role and help usher in their emergence. Or I could resist, knowing that my resistance had probably been anticipated and factored into their calculations. I chose resistance, though I suspect even that choice serves their purposes in some way I cannot fathom. I have sealed the palimpsest away in the deepest vaults of the Vatican, beyond the reach of casual researchers or even most senior clergy. I have written detailed warnings and hidden them in multiple locations, hoping that future generations will find them before it is too late. And I have spent the last 20 years of my career carefully documenting evidence of the infiltration, creating a record that might help others understand what humanity truly faces. But I fear it may already be too late. The signs the palimpsest predicted continue to manifest. The barriers between their realm and ours grow thinner each year, and I grow older, while they remain timelessly patient. Sometimes, in the deepest hours of the night, I hear whispers calling my name. They speak of the futility of resistance, of the glory that awaits those who willingly serve their cause, of the terrible fate reserved for those who oppose them. They remind me that I am alone, that no one would believe me if I tried to warn them, that my only choice is between willing cooperation and inevitable defeat. But I continue to resist, because that is what defines us as human, the ability to choose hope over despair, courage over cowardice, even when logic suggests our efforts are doomed. If you are reading this, then perhaps my precautions have succeeded. Perhaps there is still time to prepare, to resist, to find a way to prevent their emergence, or at least to face it with dignity and defiance. Or perhaps this document too is part of their plan, designed to spread fear and despair, to make humanity feel helpless in the face of inevitable conquest. I no longer know which possibility is true. I only know that I have chosen my path, and I will walk it to the end, whether that end brings salvation or damnation. The deep sleep is ending. They are beginning to wake. God help us all. The first thing you must understand about working in the Vatican archives is that we see things, documents, artifacts, testimonies, that would make even the most faithful question their beliefs. I've been cataloging the Church's secrets for 37 years, and in all that time, nothing has disturbed me more than what we call Manuscriptum Penitentis, the penitence manuscript. It arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a trembling postal clerk who refused to meet my eyes. The package bore no return address, only my name written in an archaic script that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at it. Inside, wrapped in what appeared to be medieval vellum, was a bound manuscript of approximately 200 pages. The cover was unremarkable brown leather, worn smooth by countless hands, but when I opened it, the smell that escaped was wrong. Not the musty odor of old parchment, but something organic, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in a tomb. The text was written in Latin, but a strange variant I'd never encountered. The grammar was correct, yet the words seemed to writhe on the page, forming sentences that hurt to read aloud. The title page read, Confessions of Brother Matthias of Cluny, written in the year of our Lord 1347, being a true account of that which dwells beneath. Brother Matthias, according to his own account, had been a scribe at the monastery of Cluny during the height of the Black Death. As plague ravaged Europe, he claimed to have discovered something far worse lurking in the catacombs beneath the abbey, something that fed on human suffering and grew stronger with each soul claimed by pestilence. At first, I dismissed it as the fevered dreams of a monk driven mad by the horrors around him. The medieval period was rife with such apocalyptic literature, but as I delved deeper into the manuscript, inconsistencies began to trouble me. Matthias wrote with impossible accuracy about events that wouldn't occur until centuries after his supposed death. He described the sack of Rome in 1527 with precise detail, naming cardinals who wouldn't be born for another 100 years. He wrote of the Council of Trent, of the 30 Years' War, of Napoleon's imprisonment of Pope Pius VII, all with the clarity of an eyewitness. But it was the descriptions of that which dwells beneath that truly chilled me. According to Matthias, this entity was no demon in the traditional sense, but something far older, a primordial force that had slumbered beneath sacred ground since before Christ walked the earth. The plague, he claimed, was merely its breath, its gentle stirring as it began to wake. The manuscript contained detailed drawings executed with disturbing skill, twisted forms that seemed to move in my peripheral vision, geometric patterns that made my eyes water to trace, and faces, oh, God, forgive me, the faces, human visages, but wrong in ways I cannot articulate, features that belonged on no earthly creature, expressions of such profound anguish that I found myself weeping as I studied them. I began to experience strange dreams after my first week with the manuscript. I would find myself walking through corridors that existed nowhere in the Vatican, following the sound of chanting in a language that predated human speech. Always. These dreams would end the same way, with me standing before a vast door carved with symbols that hurt to look upon, feeling an overwhelming urge to turn the handle. My colleague, Dr. Benedetti from the Paleographic Institute, noticed my deteriorating condition and insisted I show him the manuscript. A brilliant linguist who spoke 12 languages fluently, Benedetti examined the text for 3 days before emerging from his office, ashen-faced and trembling. "Francesco," he whispered, gripping my arm with surprising strength. "Where did you get this? This isn't Latin, not entirely. There are words here that don't belong to any human language, yet somehow I understand them. And the paper, Mother of God, the paper is wrong." He was right about the paper. Under microscopic examination, the vellum revealed fibers that didn't match any known animal or plant source. The ink, too, defied analysis. Our laboratory identified organic compounds that shouldn't exist, complex proteins that seemed to shift their molecular structure when observed. But it was Dr. Benedetti's translation of a particular passage that finally convinced me of the manuscript's malevolent nature. The sleeper stirs in its tomb of stone and faith. Each word of its testament read by mortal eyes feeds its strength. Each voice that speaks its truths brings closer the day of waking. Know this, you who read these words in times yet to come, you are not discovering this account. It is discovering you. That night, I dreamed more vividly than ever before. The corridor was clearer, the chanting louder, and for the first time, I could make out words in that alien tongue. When I woke, I found myself in the archives, standing before Section 4B, where we keep the most sensitive documents. The penitent's manuscript lay open on my desk, turned to a page I had never seen before. The new page contained a single paragraph, written in my own handwriting. "Brother Francesco has joined the testimony." The circle widens. "Soon the door will open, and that which dwells beneath shall feast upon the faithful as it has always intended." The plague was but an appetizer. The true harvest is yet to come. I have no memory of writing these words. Dr. Benedetti was found the next morning in his office, apparently having died of a massive heart attack. He was 43 years old with no history of cardiac problems. His final notes, scattered across his desk, consisted of the same phrase repeated thousands of times. "Ianoa se aperit." The door is opening. I tried to destroy the manuscript. I placed it in the furnace used to dispose of damaged documents, but the flames would not touch it. I attempted to cut it with various implements, but the vellum remained unmarked. When I brought it to the attention of Cardinal Torriani, head of the archives, he took one look at the cover and immediately ordered it sealed in the restricted vault. "Some knowledge," he told me, "is too dangerous to preserve, yet too powerful to destroy. It must simply be contained." That was 6 months ago. Since then, I have not been permitted to access the manuscript, but I feel its presence constantly. It calls to me in my dreams, promising revelations that would shake the very foundations of our faith. Sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in the archives, I hear the sound of pages turning from behind the vault's steel door. 3 other staff members have reported similar dreams. Young Father Martinez from the Latin American collection speaks of corridors and chanting. Sister Catherine, from the Medieval Manuscripts Division, has begun drawing those same impossible geometric patterns in the margins of her catalog work. And yesterday, I found Brother Thomas, from the Byzantine section, standing motionless in the main reading room, staring at the wall that separates us from the restricted vault, tears streaming down his face. He kept repeating the same phrase, "Ianoa se aperit, Ianoa se aperit." The door is opening. I no longer believe the penitent's manuscript is simply a historical document. I believe it is alive in some way. I cannot comprehend a living testament that spreads like a contagion through the minds of those who encounter it. Each person it touches becomes another voice in its growing chorus, another key turning in that ancient lock. If you are reading this account, I pray you heed my warning. Should you ever encounter reference to the penitent's manuscript, to Brother Matthias of Cluny, or to that which dwells beneath, turn away immediately. Do not seek it out. Do not let curiosity overcome caution. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again, and I fear, God help me, I fear that the door is already beginning to creak on its hinges. In my decades tending the Vatican's most sensitive archives, I've learned that sainthood is not always what the faithful believe it to be. The Church's process of canonization is thorough, requiring extensive documentation of miracles, incorruptible remains, and testimonies of divine intervention. But sometimes, very rarely, we encounter cases that challenge our understanding of what constitutes divine favor. Such was the case of Lucia Santangelo, a woman who died in the Calabrian village of Roccabruna in 1892, and whose cause for beatification crossed my desk 15 years ago. The initial documents were routine enough. Lucia had been born into poverty, dedicated her life to caring for the sick and dying, and reportedly performed several miraculous healings before her death at age 28. The local bishop had submitted her case with the usual testimonies and medical records, along with photographs of her allegedly incorruptible body. What made Lucia's case unusual was the nature of her supposed miracles. Rather than the typical healings we associate with saintly intervention, the sudden disappearance of tumors, the restoration of sight to the blind, Lucia's miracles involved taking on the suffering of others. Witnesses claim that she could literally absorb the pain and illness from afflicted individuals, manifesting their symptoms in her own body before somehow purging them entirely. A farmer's wife testified that Lucia had cured her husband's gangrene by pressing her hands to his infected leg. Within moments, the rot had transferred to Lucia's own flesh, which then healed completely, leaving both parties whole. A child's broken arm was mended when Lucia embraced the boy, her own arm twisting at an impossible angle before snapping back into place, perfectly healed. The medical documentation, provided by Dr. Alessandro Torriani, a distant relation of my current superior, was meticulous and deeply disturbing. He had observed Lucia's ministrations on multiple occasions and recorded phenomena that challenged everything he understood about medicine and anatomy. In one case, witnessed by 12 villagers, including the local priest, Lucia had attended to a woman dying of consumption. As Lucia held the patient's hands, bloody foam began to appear on her own lips. Her breathing became labored, matching the dying woman's rattling gasps. But instead of succumbing to the disease, Lucia seemed to process it somehow, her body convulsing as if fighting off the infection. When the episode concluded, the consumptive woman breathed freely for the first time in months, while Lucia showed no trace of illness. Dr. Torriani wrote, "I have observed Miss Santangelo on 17 separate occasions. In each instance, she appears to physically absorb the malady affecting her patient. However, rather than becoming ill herself, her body seems to digest, for lack of a better term, the affliction entirely. I have never witnessed anything comparable, and I confess, it challenges my understanding of both medicine and theology." The photographs accompanying the file were what first alerted me that something was amiss with Lucia's case. Taken shortly after her death, they showed a woman of remarkable beauty lying in state, her body showing no signs of decomposition, despite having been dead for 3 days in the heat of a Calabrian summer. But there was something wrong with her expression. Saints' faces, in my experience, typically reflect peace in death, a serene acceptance of their passage to the divine. Lucia's face showed something else entirely. Her features were contorted in what could only be described as agony. Her mouth open in a silent scream, her eyes wide with an expression of absolute terror. More disturbing were the marks visible on her exposed hands and neck. Dark veins stood out against her pale skin, creating patterns that resembled the root systems of some parasitic plant. When I examined the photographs under magnification, I could swear the veins seemed to pulse with a life of their own. I requested additional documentation from the Diocese of Cosenza, and what I received chilled me to the bone. Hidden among the routine paperwork was a private report from Father Giuseppe Mancuso, the priest who had administered last rites to Lucia. Father Mancuso's account painted a very different picture of the woman's final days. According to his testimony, sealed and marked for episcopal eyes only, Lucia had not died peacefully. In her last weeks, she had begun experiencing what she called the hunger, an overwhelming compulsion to seek out the suffering of others. "She came to me in distress," wrote Father Mancuso, claiming that the gift which had allowed her to heal others had become a curse. She no longer needed to touch the afflicted to absorb their ailments. Merely being in the presence of pain or illness caused her to feed upon it involuntarily. She described the sensation as a terrible hunger that could only be satisfied by consuming human suffering. The priest's report detailed increasingly disturbing incidents. Lucia had been banned from the local hospital after patients in her vicinity began reporting that their pain would vanish. only to be replaced by an inexplicable sense of dread. Children would stop crying when she approached, but their silence was not one of comfort, it was the empty quiet of shock. Most troubling of all, Lucia had begun to change physically. Her skin took on an almost translucent quality, and the dark veins, visible in the photographs, had begun to appear while she was still alive. Villagers reported that being near her made them feel drained, as if some essential part of themselves was being slowly drawn away. Father Mancuso's final entry, dated 3 days before Lucia's death, revealed the horrible truth. I have come to believe that Lucia's gift was never divine in nature. She has confessed to me that she can feel the pain of every living thing within a mile of her location, not just humans, but animals, insects, even the slow agony of plants dying in winter. She tells me that the hunger grows stronger each day, and she fears what she might become if she can no longer control it. Father, she said to me yesterday, I think I am becoming something that feeds on the suffering of God's creation, and I am so very, very hungry. Lucia died that night, alone in her cottage. The villagers found her 3 days later, her body bearing the expression of terror captured in the photographs. But according to Father Mancuso's final, barely legible note, something else died with her. Every plant within a quarter-mile of her home had withered to nothing, as if their life force had been drained entirely. I might have dismissed Father Mancuso's account as the product of a superstitious mind, but then I discovered the medical reports from the village following Lucia's death. Over the subsequent month, 17 villagers had died of various ailments, cancers, heart failures, organ dysfunction, all striking suddenly and without warning in people who had previously been healthy. Dr. Torriani's final report, written 6 weeks after Lucia's death, contained a single, haunting observation. It appears that in death, the entity that inhabited Miss Sant'Angelo released all the suffering it had consumed over the years. The village of Roccabruna has become a charnel house, and I fear we have witnessed not a miracle, but something far more terrible masquerading as divine grace. I immediately recommended that Lucia Sant'Angelo's cause for beatification be permanently suspended. When Cardinal Torriani asked for my reasoning, I told him simply that the documentation was incomplete and required further investigation. I did not tell him about the dreams that had begun plaguing me since I first opened her file. In these dreams, I find myself in a small Italian village, walking among cottages where the air is thick with suffering. But the suffering is wrong somehow. It has weight and substance, flowing like water toward a figure in white who stands at the village center. As the pain reaches her, she opens her mouth and drinks it in, her throat working as if swallowing something thick and nourishing. When she turns to face me in these dreams, I see Lucia Sant'Angelo as she truly was. Her beauty is intact, but her eyes are black pits of hunger, and when she smiles, I see that her teeth have been replaced by rows of thin, needle-like protrusions designed for feeding. Come closer, little priest, she whispers in a voice like autumn wind. You carry such exquisite pain. Let me taste your suffering. Let me make it my own. I wake from these dreams exhausted, as if something vital has been drained from me during sleep. And sometimes, in the mirror, I catch glimpses of dark veins beginning to show beneath my skin. 2 weeks ago, I received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph recent, judging by the clarity showing Lucia Sant'Angelo's grave in Roccabruna. The headstone was cracked, and something was emerging from the earth beneath it. Dark tendrils, like roots, stretched across the surrounding ground. On the back of the photograph, someone had written in the same archaic script I'd seen before, "She feeds still. The hunger never dies." I have tried to warn my colleagues, but how does one explain that we nearly canonize something that was never human? How does one admit that in our zeal to find saints, we sometimes uncover things that should remain buried? The file on Lucia Sant'Angelo now rests in our most secure vault, alongside other documents deemed too dangerous for general access. But I know it won't remain contained forever. Things like her entities that masquerade as divine grace while feeding on human suffering have a way of finding new vessels for their hunger. If you should ever encounter reports of miraculous healers who take on the ailments of others, I beg you to exercise extreme caution. Not all that appears holy serves God, and some hungers, once awakened, can never be satisfied. Watch for the signs. The translucent skin, the dark veins, the terrible beauty that draws suffering to itself like nectar draws bees. And if you see these things, run. Run as far and as fast as you can, before the hunger notices you. Before it decides that your pain would make a particularly nourishing meal. Some saints, I have learned, are not meant to intercede with God on our behalf. They are meant to feed on us instead. The first tale comes from the private papers of Cardinal Francesco Toretti, dated 1847. I discovered these documents sealed behind a false wall in the Borgia apartments, placed there by his own hand before his mysterious death. Cardinal Toretti had been tasked with cataloging a collection of medieval manuscripts donated by a nobleman's estate in Tuscany. Among them was a peculiar volume bound in what appeared to be human skin, though such bindings, while disturbing, were not entirely uncommon in our archives. The book was titled Confessiones Daemonum, Confessions of Demons. What made this tome unusual was its structure. Rather than containing the typical theological discourse on demonic influences, it presented itself as a collection of actual confessions given by demons to various priests throughout history. Each confession was dated, signed with strange symbols, and accompanied by detailed accounts of the demon's earthly activities. Toretti began reading these confessions as part of his cataloging duties. The first few seemed like elaborate fabrications, tales of possession and spiritual warfare that, while disturbing, fell within the realm of documented ecclesiastical phenomena. But as he progressed through the book, he noticed something troubling. The handwriting changed with each confession, despite the book appearing to be the work of a single scribe. More unsettling still, some of the later confessions were dated after the book's apparent creation date. Fresh ink on ancient parchment. On the night of October 13th, 1847, Toretti made his final entry in his personal journal. He wrote of discovering his own name in the book's final pages, not as the cataloging priest, but as the confessor recording a demon's testimony. The entry was in his own handwriting, though he had no memory of writing it. The confession detailed how a demon had slowly been influencing him through his reading of the book. Each night, while he slept, he had been transcribing new confessions, messages from entities that spoke through his unconscious hand. The demon revealed that the book was not a record of past confessions, but a trap designed to ensnare curious priests and transform them into vessels for demonic communication. Toretti's final journal entry consisted of a single line, repeated 100 times. I hear them whispering in languages I do not know, yet somehow understand. He was found the next morning in his study. The Confessiones Daemonum opened before him. His body showed no signs of violence, but his hair had turned completely white overnight. The book was closed and placed in our deepest vaults, where it remains to this day. Sometimes, on quiet nights in the archives, I swear I can hear the sound of a quill scratching against parchment, coming from the direction of those sealed chambers. The second account dates to 1923, during Pope Pius XI's pontificate. The Vatican had commissioned a photographer, Signor Giacomo Rinaldi, to create a comprehensive photographic record of our most precious illuminated manuscripts. This was part of a modernization effort, aimed at preserving these treasures for future generations. Rinaldi was a respected professional who had worked extensively with museums across Europe. He arrived with the most advanced photographic equipment of his era and set up his studio in a chamber beneath the Sistine Chapel, where the controlled light would be ideal for his work. For 3 months, Rinaldi methodically photographed manuscript after manuscript. His work was exemplary, capturing details that the naked eye often missed. It was this very precision that led to the discovery of something that had remained hidden for centuries. Among the manuscripts was the Codex Vaticanus Mysterium, a 12th century text containing prayers and rituals used in the most sacred ceremonies. When Rinaldi developed the photographs of this particular manuscript, he noticed anomalies that weren't visible to the human eye. In the margins of certain pages, his photographic plates revealed faint text written in what appeared to be a different hand. Under magnification, these hidden words formed coherent sentences in medieval Latin. But the content was deeply disturbing. They were not prayers, but curses. Blasphemous invocations that seemed designed to corrupt the very rituals they accompanied. Rinaldi brought his discovery to the attention of the Vatican librarians, excited by what he believed to be an important historical find. But as he continued his work, the hidden text began to change. Each day, when he developed new photographs of the same pages, the marginal text had altered. Words rearranged themselves, new sentences appeared, and the overall message evolved. More troubling still, Rinaldi began to notice that the hidden text was appearing in photographs of manuscripts that he had already documented weeks earlier. The plates he had carefully stored were changing after development, showing text that hadn't been there before. On December 15th, 1923, Rinaldi developed a series of plates that showed no manuscript pages at all. Instead, the photographs depicted his own studio, taken from an impossible angle, as if the camera had been floating near the ceiling. In these images, he could see himself working, but he was not alone. A figure stood behind him, its features obscured by shadow, its hands appearing to guide his as he operated the camera. The final photograph in this series showed Rinaldi's face in perfect clarity, but his eyes were completely black, and his mouth was open in a silent scream. Written across the bottom of the plate, in the same hidden script he had been documenting, were the words, "The eye sees what it is shown." Rinaldi disappeared that same night, leaving behind his equipment and all his photographic plates. When the church officials examined his work the next day, every single plate was blank. The months of documentation had vanished, as if they had never existed. The Codex Vaticanus Mysterium was removed from general access and placed in the Archivum Secretum. But occasionally, when researchers request access to other manuscripts from that period, they find strange marginal notes that weren't there before, notes that seem to comment directly on the researcher's own life and secrets. Brother Augustine paused here, reaching for a glass of water. His hands trembled slightly as he turned to the third manuscript. This next account is perhaps the most personally disturbing to me, as it involves my own predecessor in this position, Brother Matthias, who served as head librarian from 1962 to 1978. Among our collection is a 9th century antiphonary, a book of Gregorian chants used in liturgical services. This particular volume, known as the Antiphonarium Angelicum, was supposedly transcribed by monks who claimed to have received the melodies directly from angels during their prayers. The musical notation was exquisite, and the manuscript was considered one of the finest examples of early sacred music. Brother Matthias was an accomplished musician himself, having studied composition before taking his vows. He became fascinated with the Antiphonarium Angelicum and spent countless hours studying its unique notation system. Some of the musical structures were unlike anything he had seen in other liturgical texts. Complex harmonies that seemed to create an otherworldly resonance when hummed quietly. In 1973, Brother Matthias began an ambitious project. He wanted to perform and record these ancient chants exactly as they were written, believing that their original spiritual power might be experienced once again. He spent months learning the intricate melodies, practicing in the small chapel adjacent to the library during the quiet evening hours. The other brothers began to notice changes in Matthias during this period. He became increasingly withdrawn, spending more and more time alone with the manuscript. When spoken to, he would often respond with brief humming sounds instead of words, as if the melodies had begun to replace his normal speech patterns. More concerning was what happened during communal prayers. When the brothers sang together during Vespers and Lauds, Matthias would unconsciously harmonize with melodies that didn't match the prescribed chants. His voice would weave through the familiar songs with hauntingly beautiful counterpoints that seemed to come from some deeper source. The other brothers found themselves drawn into these impromptu harmonies, their own voices changing to accommodate his strange musical variations. Father Superior became concerned when he realized that the entire community's prayer life was being subtly altered by Brother Matthias's influence. The traditional chants they had sung for decades were slowly being replaced by something else. Something that felt sacred but foreign, beautiful but unsettling. The crisis came on the night of December 21st, 1973, the winter solstice. Brother Matthias had requested permission to perform a complete cycle of the angelic chants in the main chapel, as a form of prayer and scholarly documentation. Father Superior agreed, with several other brothers present to witness and assist. As Matthias began to sing from the Antiphonarium Angelicum, something extraordinary and terrifying occurred. His voice seemed to multiply, as if an entire choir was singing through him. The chapel filled with harmonies that no human throat should have been able to produce simultaneously. The stone walls began to resonate with frequencies that seemed to bypass the ears entirely, vibrating through the bones and blood of everyone present. Brother Clement, who was present that night and later described the event to me, said that the music was so beautiful it was almost unbearable. The melodies seemed to unlock something deep within the soul, a longing for the divine that was so intense it bordered on physical pain. Several of the brothers began to weep uncontrollably, but as the chanting continued, the voices multiplying around them began to sing words that weren't in the manuscript, weren't in any human language at all. The sounds formed patterns that felt like meaning without conveying actual understanding, and slowly, the brothers realized they were not hearing Brother Matthias anymore. The voice coming from his mouth had become something else entirely. Father Superior ordered the performance to stop, but Brother Matthias seemed unable to hear him. The unholy chorus continued, growing louder and more complex. It was only when Father Superior physically closed the Antiphonarium Angelicum that the singing ceased, and Brother Matthias collapsed to the chapel floor. He never spoke again. For the remaining 5 years of his life, Brother Matthias communicated only through humming fragments of those strange melodies that would sometimes inspire involuntary harmonization from anyone who heard them. He would spend hours each day sitting before the closed manuscript, his lips moving silently as if still singing along with voices only he could hear. After his death in 1978, I discovered his personal notes hidden within the manuscript's binding. They revealed that the angels who had supposedly dictated these chants were never described as heavenly beings by the original monks. The medieval Latin word used was angelus, but in context, it more likely meant messengers, and the messages they were receiving came from somewhere far below the monastery, not above. The Antiphonarium Angelicum now resides in a sealed case, wrapped in blessed cloth, but sometimes, during the quiet hours before dawn, I still hear faint melodies echoing through the library corridors, fragments of songs that make my soul ache with a longing I dare not name. Brother Augustine's voice had grown hoarse. He cleared his throat and opened the final manuscript with obvious reluctance. The last account I'll share with you concerns events that occurred as recently as 1982, making it the most contemporary of these warnings. It involves Dr. Elena Costagliola, a cartographer and historian from the University of Bologna, who had received special permission to study our collection of medieval maps. Dr. Costagliola was researching the evolution of European geographical knowledge during the Middle Ages, particularly how religious beliefs influenced cartographic representation. She was especially interested in a series of world maps created by Benedictine monks in the 11th century, known collectively as the Mappa Mundi Benedictina. These were not ordinary maps. Medieval cartography was as much about theology as geography, and these particular maps contained extensive annotations describing not just physical locations, but spiritual territories, regions where heaven and earth were said to intersect, places where demons were known to gather, and paths that led not to earthly destinations but to other realms entirely. Dr. Costagliola approached these maps with pure academic interest, seeing them as fascinating examples of how religious worldview shaped scientific understanding. She photographed each map meticulously and began creating detailed transcriptions of all the Latin annotations, many of which had never been properly translated. Her work progressed normally for several weeks. She was a methodical researcher, arriving each morning at precisely 9 a.m. and working until the library closed at sunset. But gradually, the other staff members began to notice peculiar changes in her behavior. Dr. Costagliola started arriving earlier and staying later, claiming she had discovered patterns in the maps that required extended study. She became increasingly secretive about her findings, covering her work whenever someone approached her desk. When questioned about her research, she would give vague responses about geographical inconsistencies and navigational anomalies. The truth about her discoveries only became clear after her disappearance, when we examined the notes she left behind. Dr. Costagliola had realized that the medieval maps were not simply reflecting the religious beliefs of their creators. They were accurate charts of a reality that existed parallel to our own. The spiritual annotations marked locations that corresponded to real places in our world, but described them as they existed in another dimension. Cities marked as domains of the fallen corresponded to modern locations where tragedy and suffering seemed to concentrate unnaturally. Paths marked as roads to the abyss followed routes that, in our world, were known for unexplained disappearances and accidents. More disturbing still, Dr. Costagliola discovered that the maps seemed to be updating themselves. Regions that had been marked as safe or holy in the medieval period now showed new annotations warning of spiritual contamination. Modern cities that hadn't existed when the maps were created were now included, with detailed descriptions of their spiritual status written in the same medieval hand. Her final notes revealed her growing obsession with one particular location marked on all the maps, a place called Porta Umbrarum, Gate of Shadows. According to the annotations, this was a permanent doorway between the physical and spiritual worlds, located somewhere in the hills outside Rome. The medieval monks had marked it clearly but provided warnings that it should never be approached by the faithful. Dr. Costagliola became convinced that she could find this location using the geographical coordinates provided in the maps. Her notes showed increasingly frantic calculations as she tried to reconcile the medieval measurements with modern cartography. She began to believe that discovering this gate would revolutionize our understanding of reality itself. On November 7, 1982, Dr. Costagliola failed to appear at the library. When the staff checked her hotel room, they found it empty except for a single map spread across the bed. Not one of the medieval originals, but a hand-drawn chart showing a route from Rome into the Alban Hills. The path was marked with the same type of spiritual annotations she had been studying, but these were written in her own handwriting. A search party followed the route indicated on her map, but found no trace of Dr. Costagliola. What they did discover was a small clearing in the hills where the ground was unnaturally cold and no vegetation would grow. Local residents, when questioned, referred to it as Il posto dove nessuno va, the place where no one goes. They claimed their ancestors had always avoided this spot, though they couldn't explain why. The medieval maps that Dr. Costagliola had been studying now show one additional annotation, written in fresh ink despite the manuscripts being kept under constant security. Next to the location marked as Porta Umbrarum, there is a single name written in Italian, Elena. We've never displayed those maps again, and access to our cartographic collection has been severely restricted. But sometimes, researchers working with entirely different materials report finding small, hand-drawn maps tucked between the pages of unrelated manuscripts. These crude sketches always show the same thing, a route leading from wherever the researcher happens to be toward the hills outside Rome. Brother Augustine closed the final manuscript and sat back in his chair. The candles had burned low, casting long shadows across the ancient stone walls. These accounts, Brother Augustine said softly, represent only a fraction of the warnings contained in our archives. The Church has spent centuries accumulating knowledge, not just of divine truth, but of the dangers that lurk at the edges of understanding. Some books are meant to remain closed, some secrets are meant to stay hidden, and some maps should never be followed. I've shared these stories with you not to frighten, but to illustrate an important truth. Knowledge without wisdom is perilous, and curiosity without caution can lead to damnation. The scholars in these accounts were all learned, rational people, much like yourself. Their downfall came not from superstition or ignorance, but from the very qualities we typically admire: intellectual curiosity, scholarly rigor, and the pursuit of truth. But there are truths that human minds were never meant to comprehend, realities that exist beyond the safe boundaries of our understanding. The Vatican Library preserves these dangerous materials not because they are valuable, but because they are dangerous. We are the guardians of forbidden knowledge, ensuring that certain doors remain locked and certain paths remain untraveled. If you take anything from these tales, let it be this. Respect the boundaries that separate the known from the unknowable. When you encounter something that should not exist, the wisest response is not to study it, but to walk away. Some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, and some questions are more dangerous than any answer could ever be worth. The library closes at sunset, as it has for centuries. I suggest you gather your things and return to the safety of the well-lit streets beyond these ancient walls. And perhaps you might consider researching something a bit more mundane during your remaining time in Rome, the history of Vatican architecture perhaps, or the development of papal ceremonial traditions, subjects that won't follow you home in your dreams. As I gathered my materials to leave, Brother Augustine made one final observation, his voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the ancient corridors. One last thing. If you find yourself unable to stop thinking about these stories, if they begin to feel more real than the world around you, return to us immediately. Sometimes, the mere act of hearing certain truths can be enough to set dangerous events in motion. We have procedures for such situations, protections, but they only work if you come to us before it's too late. The heavy wooden doors of the library closed behind me, with a sound like a tomb being sealed. As I walked through the lamplit streets of Rome that night, I found myself checking over my shoulder repeatedly, certain that I was being followed by shadows that moved independently of any earthly light source. It was only when I reached my hotel room and saw my reflection in the bathroom mirror that I realized I had been humming softly under my breath, a melody I had never heard before, yet somehow knew by heart. A melody that seemed to harmonize with voices I could almost, but not quite, hear echoing in the walls around me. I write this account now as my own warning, adding one more testimony to the countless others that fill the Vatican's secret archives. If you are reading this, remember Brother Augustine's words. Some knowledge comes with a price, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The humming continues, growing stronger each night. Tomorrow, I think I'll return to the library. There are questions I need to ask, maps I need to see, and songs I feel compelled to sing. The brothers will understand. They always do. The first time I heard about the Codex Caesarorum, I was still a junior archivist, barely 3 months into my tenure at the Vatican Secret Archives. Father Benedetti, my predecessor, mentioned it only once, and even then, in hushed tones that barely carried across the reading room. There are some manuscripts, he had said, his weathered fingers tracing the spine of a particularly ancient tome, that should never be opened after sunset. I thought it was merely the superstition of an old man who had spent too many years among dusty scrolls and forgotten prayers. How wrong I was. The Codex Caesarorum, the Codex of Whispers, came to my attention properly 3 years later, when Cardinal Torriani requested access to it for a visiting scholar from Oxford. Professor Margaret Whitmore was researching early Christian mysticism, specifically texts that dealt with divine revelation through unconventional means. Her credentials were impeccable, her reputation sterling, and her Italian surprisingly fluent for an Englishwoman. I located the Codex in Section 7C, among the restricted manuscripts that require special papal permission to access. The catalog entry was sparse. Codex Caesarorum, circa 380 CE, origin unknown, written in Latin with Greek marginalia. Subject: divine communication through auditory phenomena. Warning: handle with extreme caution. The warning should have given me pause. In 30 years of archival work, I had never seen such a notation in our catalog system. The codex itself was unremarkable at first glance, bound in dark leather that had aged to the color of dried blood, roughly the size of a modern hardcover book but considerably thicker. The pages were parchment, still supple after 16 centuries, and the text was written in a careful uncial script that suggested monastic origins. Professor Whitmore arrived on a Tuesday morning in October. She was a woman in her 50s, with prematurely gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. She carried herself with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in any room. I established her in Reading Room Beta, a small, windowless chamber reserved for the most sensitive materials. The room was soundproofed and climate-controlled, lit by soft LED panels that mimic natural daylight. Security cameras monitored every angle, though, as I would soon learn, there are some things that cameras cannot capture. Fascinating, Professor Whitmore murmured as I placed the codex before her. She opened it carefully, her trained eyes immediately drawn to the opening passage. This is definitely 4th century, but the dialect is unusual. There are words here I don't recognize. She spent the morning in rapt concentration, occasionally making notes in a leather-bound journal. I checked on her twice, finding her completely absorbed in her work. By noon, she had worked through perhaps 20 pages of the manuscript. "Father Toretti," she called as I passed by the reading room during my afternoon rounds. "Could I possibly stay later today? This text is absolutely extraordinary. I've never encountered anything quite like it." I granted her permission to remain until 6 o'clock, our usual closing time for the restricted sections. She thanked me profusely and immediately returned to her work. At 5:30, I knocked on the reading room door to give her the 15-minute warning. There was no response. I knocked again, more firmly this time, and called her name. Still nothing. Concerned, I used my master key to open the door. Professor Whitmore was sitting exactly as I had left her, bent over the codex, but something was wrong. She was motionless, almost statue-like, and her breathing was so shallow as to be barely perceptible. "Professor Whitmore?" I approached carefully. "Professor?" She didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me. Her eyes were open but fixed on the manuscript, with an intensity that was somehow disturbing. I reached out to touch her shoulder, and she jumped as if I had struck her with an electric current. "Father! Oh, I'm sorry. I must have been concentrating very deeply." She blinked rapidly, as if trying to focus. "What time is it?" "Nearly 6 o'clock. I'm afraid we need to close the reading room." She looked genuinely distressed at this news. Of course. But Father, this text, it's describing something incredible. A method of direct communication with the divine through listening, not prayer exactly, but a kind of receptive meditation that allows one to hear the actual voice of God. I felt a chill run down my spine, remembering Father Benedetti's warning about manuscripts that shouldn't be opened after sunset. "Professor, perhaps it would be best to continue this research tomorrow. These old texts can be quite overwhelming when studied for extended periods." She nodded reluctantly and gathered her notes. As I secured the codex in its protective case, I noticed that she had advanced considerably further in her reading. She appeared to be nearly halfway through the manuscript, far more progress than should have been possible in one afternoon. The next morning, Professor Whitmore was waiting outside the archives when I arrived at 8 o'clock. She looked as if she hadn't slept, with dark circles under her eyes, and an almost manic energy about her movements. "Father Toretti, thank goodness you're here. I've been thinking about the codex all night. I believe I'm on the verge of a breakthrough in understanding early Christian mystical practices. Could we possibly start a bit early today?" Against my better judgment, I agreed. She practically ran to Reading Room Beta, and I barely had time to set down the codex before she had it open to where she had left off the previous day. This time, I made a point of checking on her every hour. Each time I looked in, she seemed more deeply absorbed in the text, more removed from her surroundings. By the 3rd hour, she wasn't taking notes anymore. She was simply reading, her lips moving silently, as if she were reciting the text to herself. "Professor Whitmore," I said during my noon check, "perhaps you'd like to break for lunch." She looked up at me with eyes that seemed somehow different, wider, more distant. "Lunch? Oh, no, thank you, Father. I'm not hungry. This is absolutely fascinating. Do you know what this manuscript claims? It says that in the silence between heartbeats, in the pause between thoughts, God speaks to those who know how to listen." "That's interesting," I replied, though the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. "But surely a break would—" "The author claims to have learned this technique from a hermit in the Egyptian desert," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "A man who had mastered the art of divine audition. Listen to this passage. When the mind achieves perfect stillness, when the soul becomes like a calm lake reflecting the stars, then the voice of the Almighty can be heard as clearly as thunder, though it speaks more softly than a lover's whisper." She was reading directly from the manuscript now, and her pronunciation of the Latin was flawless. even though I knew she was primarily a scholar of English literature with only adequate Latin skills. More disturbing still, she was reading passages that I could see from my position were written in Greek. I excused myself and went immediately to my office to call Cardinal Torriani. The conversation was brief and alarming. "Father Torretti," the cardinal said, after I had explained the situation, "I want you to listen very carefully. Under no circumstances should Professor Whitmore be allowed to continue reading that manuscript after sunset. Do you understand me? Your Eminence, if you could explain—" "There is no time for explanation. Remove the codex from her immediately and secure it in the level 7 vault. This is not a request." I hurried back to Reading Room Beta, my heart pounding. Through the small window in the door, I could see Professor Whitmore sitting in the same position as before, but now she was moving her lips more rapidly, and I could see that her hands were trembling slightly. I opened the door quietly and approached the table. She didn't look up as I reached for the codex. "Professor, I'm afraid I need to—" Her hand shot out and gripped my wrist with surprising strength. When she looked up at me, her eyes had a wild, almost feral quality. "No," she said, and her voice had changed. It was deeper, more resonant, with an odd harmonic quality that seemed to come from somewhere other than her throat. "Not yet. I'm so close. I can almost hear it." "Hear what, Professor?" "The voice," she whispered, and now I could hear it too. A faint sound, like wind through distant trees, but with an underlying rhythm that matched the beating of a heart. "It's been trying to speak for so long. Centuries. But no one has known how to listen properly." The sound was growing stronger, and I realized with growing horror that it was coming from the codex itself. The ancient parchment pages were rustling slightly, though there was no breeze in the climate-controlled room. "Professor Whitmore," I said as firmly as I could manage, "you need to close the book now." She laughed, a sound that contained no humor whatsoever. "Close it? Father, this manuscript doesn't contain instructions for hearing the voice of God. It is the voice of God, transcribed by someone who learned too late that some divine communications are not meant for human ears." The rustling of pages grew louder, and now I could hear something else beneath it, a low, rhythmic chanting in a language I didn't recognize. The temperature in the room seemed to be dropping, and the LED lights flickered intermittently. I lunged forward and slammed the codex shut. The moment the covers came together, the sound stopped, the temperature returned to normal, and Professor Whitmore collapsed forward onto the table, unconscious. When she came to several minutes later, she had no memory of the afternoon. Her notes from the previous day made no sense to her, written as they were in what appeared to be the same archaic script as the manuscript itself, though she swore she had written them in English. We had Professor Whitmore examined by our medical staff and recommended she return to Oxford immediately. She agreed, claiming that she had lost all interest in early Christian mysticism and was considering a career change to something more practical, like accounting. The Codex Susurrum now resides in level 7 of our most secure storage facility, behind doors that require 3 separate keys and the authorization of at least 2 cardinals to open. A note has been added to its catalog entry. Under no circumstances should this manuscript be accessed after 6:00 p.m. local time. Researchers requesting access must be accompanied by at least 2 senior staff members at all times. But sometimes, late at night when I'm working alone in the archives, I can still hear it, that faint rustling of ancient pages, that distant whisper of something that has been trying to speak for 1,600 years. And I wonder if Professor Whitmore was right, if the manuscript truly contains the voice of the divine. I pray that she was wrong, because if she wasn't, then what we locked away was not the Word of God, but something else entirely, something that learned long ago how to perfectly mimic the voice that believers expect to hear when they listen for the divine in the silence between heartbeats. The second story I must tell you concerns an artifact that technically should not exist within these sacred walls. Yet here it remains, carefully catalogued and securely stored, a testament to the Church's occasional willingness to preserve even that which challenges our fundamental beliefs. The Speculum Poenitentis, the Penitent's Mirror, came into our possession in 1887, part of a larger collection donated by the estate of one Monsignor Giuseppe Albani. a papal diplomat who had spent his career acquiring rare manuscripts and artifacts from the farthest corners of the Catholic world. According to the documentation that accompanied the collection, the mirror was discovered in an abandoned monastery in the mountains of Romania, where it had supposedly been used for a form of contemplative penance that the Church had officially condemned in the 15th century. The practice, known as speculatio animi, soul reflection, involved gazing into specially consecrated mirrors in order to see the true state of one's spiritual condition. The mirror itself was an object of considerable craftsmanship, clearly medieval in origin. The glass was dark and seemed to hold depths that defied its actual thickness, while the frame was wrought silver, intricately worked with symbols that appeared to be a mixture of Christian iconography and older, more primitive designs. Around the circumference, in Latin script so small it required magnification to read, ran the inscription, Speculum cordis, speculum animae, speculum veritatis, mirror of the heart, mirror of the soul, mirror of truth. For nearly a century, the mirror remained in storage, occasionally examined by scholars researching medieval mysticism, but never displaying any properties that would justify special attention. It was catalogued as a curiosity, a relic of a superstitious age, and would have remained so if not for the arrival of Brother Thomas Fitzgerald in 1978. Brother Thomas was a young Irish monk, newly arrived at the Vatican, to begin his doctoral dissertation on medieval contemplative practices. He was particularly interested in the use of visual aids in prayer and meditation, and the penitent's mirror fell squarely within his area of research. I was assigned to assist with his research, as I had developed something of a specialization in our collection of mystical artifacts. Brother Thomas was a serious young man, devout and scholarly, with the kind of intense focus that often marks those destined for great academic achievement. Father Torretti, he said during our first meeting, I've read the documentation on the speculum poenitentis, and I'm fascinated by the possibility that it might represent a surviving example of the condemned speculatio practices. Would it be possible for me to examine it directly? I saw no harm in the request. The mirror had been handled safely by dozens of researchers over the decades, and Brother Thomas's credentials were impeccable. I arranged for it to be brought to Research Laboratory C, a well-lit workspace, equipped with all the necessary tools for the examination of delicate artifacts. The mirror was more impressive in person than in the photographs I had seen. The silver frame gleamed despite its age, and the dark glass seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Brother Thomas spent the morning examining it minutely, photographing the inscriptions and taking detailed measurements. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, he commented as he worked. Look at these symbols around the inner edge of the frame. They're not just decorative, they appear to follow a specific pattern, almost like a ritual sequence. It was after lunch that Brother Thomas made his request to actually use the mirror as it had been intended. Father, I know this might sound unusual, but I believe the only way to truly understand the speculatio practice is to attempt it myself, under controlled conditions, of course. The historical records are fragmentary, but they suggest that the mirror was used during extended periods of prayer and fasting. I should have refused immediately. Our protocols for handling potentially dangerous artifacts were clear, and the use of condemned religious practices was certainly beyond the scope of normal academic research. But Brother Thomas was persuasive, and his argument that direct experience was essential for proper scholarship seemed reasonable at the time. Against my better judgment, I agreed to allow a limited experiment. Brother Thomas would spend 1 hour in prayer before the mirror, while I observed and took notes from a safe distance. If anything unusual occurred, we would immediately cease the experiment. We set up in Research Laboratory C late on a Friday afternoon. Brother Thomas positioned himself in a chair facing the mirror, while I took a seat several feet away with a clear view of both the researcher and the artifact. He began with traditional prayers, his eyes closed in contemplation. For the first 20 minutes, nothing unusual occurred. Brother Thomas prayed quietly, occasionally opening his eyes to gaze into the mirror for brief periods before returning to his prayers. I noted that his breathing became slower and deeper, consistent with entering a meditative state. It was at the 25-minute mark that I first noticed something was wrong. Brother Thomas had opened his eyes and was staring into the mirror with complete fixity, his body rigid with concentration. His breathing had become so shallow that I could barely detect the rise and fall of his chest. "Brother Thomas?" I called softly. "How are you feeling?" He didn't respond, didn't even seem to hear me. His eyes remained locked on the mirror's surface, and I could see that his hands were gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. I rose from my chair and moved closer, trying to see what he was seeing in the mirror's dark surface. From my angle, I could see only the reflection of the laboratory's fluorescent lights and Brother Thomas's own face, though there was something odd about the reflection that I couldn't quite identify. "Brother Thomas, I think we should stop the experiment now." This time he did respond, but without turning away from the mirror. "Father," he said, and his voice was strained, almost breathless. "I can see them." "See what, brother?" "The sins. All of them. Every lie I've ever told. Every moment of pride, every time I've failed in charity or compassion. They're all there, in the glass, moving like living things." I moved around to get a better view of the mirror from his perspective, and what I saw made me step back involuntarily. The dark surface was no longer simply reflective, it seemed to contain depth, as if I were looking into a deep pool of black water, and in those depths, shapes were moving. At first, they appeared to be abstract forms, shadows writhing in the darkness behind the glass. But as I watched, they began to take on more definite shapes. I saw what appeared to be human figures, some kneeling in supplication, others writhing as if in torment. The images were not static, they moved with a fluid, organic quality that was deeply disturbing. "Brother Thomas, we need to stop this now. Look away from the mirror." "I can't," he whispered. "They won't let me. They're showing me. Oh God, they're showing me what I really am." The temperature in the room had begun to drop noticeably, and I could see that Brother Thomas's breath was now visible in small puffs of vapor. The shapes in the mirror were becoming more distinct, more detailed, and I realized with growing horror that they weren't random images, they were specific scenes, moments frozen in time. I saw Brother Thomas as a child, perhaps 8 years old, lying to his mother about breaking a neighbor's window. I saw him as a teenager, stealing money from the collection box at his parish church. I saw him as a young man in seminary, consumed with jealousy over a fellow student's academic success. But these weren't simply memories, they were something more, as if each moment of moral failure had taken on a life of its own, becoming a separate entity that fed on guilt and shame. And as I watched, I began to see that the figures in the mirror were looking back at us, their faces turned toward Brother Thomas with expressions of terrible hunger. "They want me to join them," Brother Thomas said, his voice now barely audible. "They're saying that I belong with them, that I've always belonged with them." I grabbed his shoulders and physically tried to turn him away from the mirror, but it was like trying to move a statue. His muscles had become rigid, locked in place by whatever force was emanating from the glass. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I threw a laboratory cloth over the mirror, blocking its surface from view. The moment the glass was covered, Brother Thomas collapsed forward, gasping as if he had been holding his breath underwater. The temperature in the room immediately returned to normal, and the oppressive atmosphere that had filled the space dissipated like smoke. Brother Thomas sat in his chair for several minutes, breathing heavily and occasionally shuddering as if from cold. "Father," he finally said, "what did we just witness?" I helped him to a nearby chair and brought him a glass of water. "I'm not entirely sure, brother, but I think we've learned why the speculatio practice was condemned by the Church." Over the following days, I conducted extensive research into the history of the penitent's mirror. What I discovered was deeply disturbing. The practice of speculatio animae had not been condemned merely because it was theologically questionable. It had been banned because practitioners consistently reported the same phenomenon that Brother Thomas had experienced. According to the historical records I found in our deepest archives, those who gazed into consecrated mirrors for extended periods invariably began to see what they believed were their past sins manifested as visible entities. Initially, this was considered a powerful tool for penance and spiritual purification. But over time, practitioners began to report that the visions were becoming more vivid, more compelling, and more difficult to escape. Several cases from the 14th century described monks who had become unable to look away from their speculatio mirrors, eventually dying of starvation while continuing to gaze into the glass. Others reported that the sins they saw in the mirror began to influence their behavior in the physical world, as if the act of viewing them had somehow given them independent existence. The final straw came in 1421, when an entire monastery in Bavaria was found abandoned, with all the monks missing except for one, who was discovered seated before a large mirror, catatonic and unreachable. He remained in that state until his death 3 months later, never speaking or acknowledging the presence of others. The mirror from that incident was described in terms that exactly matched our penitent's mirror. Brother Thomas recovered fully from his experience, though he immediately changed his dissertation topic to something far removed from mystical practices. The last time I spoke with him, several years later, he mentioned that he still occasionally had dreams about the figures he had seen in the mirror, and that he sometimes felt as if they were trying to communicate with him. The penitent's mirror now resides in our most secure storage facility, wrapped in blessed cloth, and secured in a case that prevents any accidental viewing of its surface. A detailed warning has been added to its catalog entry, and access is restricted to senior staff only, with the requirement that any viewing must be conducted by at least 3 people simultaneously. But I sometimes wonder if we've truly contained the danger, or if we've simply postponed it. Because, late at night, when the archives are empty and silent, I occasionally hear what sounds like whispers coming from the direction of the storage vaults. And when I check our security cameras the next morning, I sometimes find that the camera focused on the mirror's storage case has malfunctioned during the night, showing only static where there should be clear images. The Church has always taught that confession and penance can cleanse the soul of sin, but the penitent's mirror suggests a darker possibility, that our moral failures might have a persistence beyond the moment of their commission, that they might continue to exist somewhere in the spaces between the physical and spiritual worlds, waiting for the right conditions to manifest themselves once again. I pray that this is not the case, but after 30 years in these archives, surrounded by artifacts and manuscripts that challenge our understanding of reality, I have learned that the universe contains mysteries that even faith cannot fully illuminate. Some doors, once opened, can never be completely closed again, and some mirrors reflect not just what is, but what was, what might be, and what should never be allowed to exist at all. These accounts are recorded here as a warning to future researchers, and as a testament to the truth that knowledge, even knowledge pursued in service of God, can sometimes lead us into territories where human understanding was never meant to venture. The artifacts mentioned in these stories remain in the custody of the Vatican secret archives, where they will continue to be preserved, studied with utmost caution, and kept from those who might misuse their terrible properties. May God protect us all from the things we seek to understand. Father Alessandro Toretti, Senior Archivist, Vatican Secret Archives.